Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for this intriguing and ingenious part of your word. Help me to be clear-minded. Help all of us to, by your word and spirit, become more like Jesus, please, as a result of spending time in Proverbs this morning. Please help us now. Amen. The other day I was down at our local swimming pool and I couldn't help but notice how different people are in the way that they swim laps. Have you ever noticed that? Some people pound up and down the pool and there's lots of splashing and water's going everywhere, but other people, they just seem to glide through the water and there's hardly a ripple. Some people are really slow and steady swimmers, lap after lap after lap after lap. They just keep going, whereas other people just go flat out for 2 or 3 laps and then they stop and then they have a rest and then they go flat out again. And some blokes dive in the deep end and get straight into it, and other blokes just sort of go down the stairs and walk around for a little bit just to acclimatise themselves to the water. And other people just arrive with heaps of equipment, flippers and kickboards and water bottles, and they're all this stacked up at the end of the lane. And other blokes just get in and they just swim and they haven't even got goggles on. It's a bit like life. We're all different at how we go about it. And some of us blokes here probably go flat out for short bursts and then we stop and then we rest for a while and then we go like a bull at a gate again. And others of us here are probably just the more slow and steady. And some of us make lots of noise as we splash around in life and water goes everywhere. And others of us just quietly go about life. And some of us go through life with heaps of equipment. Cars and boats and gadgets and others of us not so much. Here's the thing I want you to think about swimming and life, and that is when you want to get serious about it. You know, when a swimmer is finished just mucking around and they want to make it more than a hobby and they want to be the best that they can be, they get a coach. They get someone to help them with it. And guys, if we're going to be serious about life, if you're finished mucking around and you really want to be the best bloke that you can be, we need a coach. Question is who? Who's the best coach we could go for? The other blokes at your table? Friends? Family? Dr. Phil? They all might have a role, but really this is where the Old Testament book of Proverbs comes into its own, because Proverbs is very much a life coach book in the Bible. It's a book all about how to be the best person you can be and how to make the best life choices that you can make. This is a book all about foolproofing your life. And there's no better place to see that than in those first 6 verses, because those verses explain the purpose and the pattern of the book, and they start to hint at the best person to get life tips from. Let me show you what I mean by firstly looking at the purpose of Proverbs, because it's one of those great books of the Bible that actually tells you up front why it's there. Verse 2. It's there for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. And there's lots of stuff in those verses. The big 3 words are wisdom, discipline and prudence. You can tell they're the big 3 because they're the ones that get repeated, aren't they? Wisdom is there in verse 2 and 5. It pops up again in verse 6. Discipline is there in verse 2 and 3. Prudence, 3 and 4. Let's quickly think about each one. Firstly, wisdom. By wisdom, Proverbs means more than simply being smart and knowing stuff. In the Bible, wisdom is practical knowledge. Wisdom is making the right use of facts. Wisdom is about being street smart. Wisdom is about being able to figure out good choices. It's knowing what to do next. It's like the tragic but very silly story I heard about a bloke named Danny Lewis. According to his friends, Danny was a real Mr. Fix-It type of guy. Danny knew everything there was to know about electronics. Toasters, hairdryers, televisions, you name it, evidently Danny could fix it. But poor old Danny Lewis died when he was electrocuted while trying to fix a radio which he'd left turned on and plugged into a power point all while Danny was sitting in the bath. Sounds ridiculous, I know, but that is the classic difference between knowing stuff and being wise. Danny knew a lot of stuff, evidently, about electronics, but he didn't really integrate those facts into an effective life strategy. Proverbs doesn't want us to be fixing radios in the bath. It wants us to have wisdom, practical knowledge. Doesn't end there. In this opening statement, discipline is another key word. And by discipline, it's not referring to punishment for doing something wrong. It's not that sort of discipline. It's discipline in the sense of being in control of yourself, being in command of yourself. Sometimes we speak of elite sports people as being disciplined, don't we? They've got a disciplined routine, and that means they have mastery over themselves. They have self-control on what they eat. They have mental toughness to get up early and train each day. That's discipline in Proverbs. It's a book designed to help us take control of ourselves, be the best men we can be. It's also a book designed for give us providence. And by providence here is the idea of making good judgments in planning for the future. It's having an eye for what's ahead. It's prudence. It's having foresight into what could go wrong or right in the future. Prudence is about being able to make decisions now so that they will be most effective in the future. Wisdom, discipline, prudence. All of which is setting Proverbs up to be a pretty neat sort of book, don't you think? I visited our local library the other day, wandered through the self-help category. I found heaps of books with titles like How to Change the Way You Live, How to Be Confident, How to Be Happy, How to Declutter Your Life, How to Be Captivating, How to Be Assertive, How Not to Worry, How to Perform Under Pressure, How to Be a Great Dad. My personal favourite, How to Juggle Fatherhood, a Successful Career, Me Time and Looking Good. Now, I won't tell you how many I ended up borrowing, but in one sense I didn't even have to go to the library at all because that's what Proverbs is all about. From no less than God himself. Here is a book on how to juggle fatherhood, a career, me time and looking good. Here is a book all about how not just to survive life, but to succeed in life. Mind you, having said all that, and hopefully now whetted your appetite for actually reading what's in Proverbs, the book very quickly adds to this tantalising purpose by telling us a pattern and how it's structured and what we should expect in the book, and it's maybe not what some of us do expect. Because when most Christians think of Proverbs, we usually think in terms of just a long list of pithy little one-liners and, little sayings about life. He who guards his lips guards his life. Pride only breeds quarrels. A cheerful look brings joy to the heart. Sort of these one-liners that get tossed out. That's how we think of Proverbs. But the book itself warns us that there's more to the book than simply that. Verse 5, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables and sayings and riddles of the wise. In other words, this is a book that's got a lot of stuff going on in it. This is a book that's going to require a little bit of thinking. This is a book that's got sayings, riddles, parables, as well as those pithy little one-line proverbs that most of us are familiar with. And therefore we need to realise that the way the book is actually structured, it's a little bit more subtle and sophisticated than maybe we sometimes think. That's why I'm a fan of reading Proverbs as it is written down to us, rather than what is often done with Proverbs, which is pulling it apart into all its different topics. That's often how we treat Proverbs, isn't it? We just pull out all the verses that have to do with friendship. And then we pull out all the little pithy one-liners that have to do with work. And then we pull out all the one-liners that have to do with how to speak. And we look at the book topically rather than how it's actually written. Now, there's a place for that, but I suspect if we were meant to do that, that's how the book would have presented itself. The genius of Proverbs is that it wants us to know that living life is more complex than simply knowing a bunch of one-liners. Wisdom comes from knowing which one-liner to apply. Let me give you an example. Think about the modern proverb, haste makes waste. Okay, haste makes waste. Most of us have heard that one. It's the idea if you rush and do something, you often make mistakes and you end up ruining it and wasting things. I can remember once rushing to finish painting a room in our house. It was getting late into the evening, so I just kept rushing and finished it, even though the light was poor. And the next morning I got up, looked at the room in daylight, awful. Had to do the whole thing, start all over again. And so we learn, don't we? We say to ourselves, well, haste makes waste. That is so true. Next time I'm going to do things differently. But that does not mean that haste makes waste is always true in every circumstance. For example, if you wake up in the morning and you're feeling sick, real sick, you're having difficulty breathing. Now you don't say, well, hang on a tick. Haste makes waste. I learnt that when I painted the room. I'm not going to go rushing off to the hospital now. I'm just going to take my time, slow down with this decision. That may not be wise at all. In that situation, haste makes waste is not the proverb to reach for. He who hesitates is lost. That might be the proverb to pull out. And that's what the book of Proverbs actually wants to teach us as the book unfolds. Because what we're going to discover is literally hundreds of parables and sayings and riddles of the wise and proverbs, but the real genius to the pattern of the book, the brilliance of how the book is put together, is that overlaid on top of all these sayings is a set of guidelines that will help us wisely decide which is the best parable to apply. And over the next couple of sessions this morning, I hope we're going to discover what some of these fundamental guidelines are. For now, let me close this session by pulling out what I reckon is the first of them. Here is a first principle truth which will help foolproof your life. It's actually tucked away in the very first verse of the book in terms of the person of Proverbs, verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Now, within the Bible, I'm sure many of you are aware, Solomon is the great champion and founder of wisdom. As verse points out, he is King David's son, and he ruled over Israel during the golden age of Israel, at a time of remarkable wealth and prosperity and peace, a time when Solomon developed schools of wisdom and learning. 1 Kings in the Old Testament tells us that God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon spoke 3,000 parables, and he described plant life and taught about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. And the significance of all of this is that within the Bible, this tight connection between Solomon and wisdom, it gets picked up in the Bible and it gets developed more broadly into a tight connection between God's king and wisdom. And that just like back in Solomon's time, if you want to get real insights into life, if you want to know how best to live life, then you go to God's appointed king. He's the one from whom wisdom comes. Now, the tragedy, of course, is that most of the kings after Solomon, if you know your Old Testament, most of them were complete duds. But the Old Testament never gives up on this connection between God's king and wisdom. For example, the prophet Isaiah, he predicted a future mighty king of God who was coming, a Christ was coming, a Messiah was coming, and Isaiah describes him as the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding. Do you hear again that connection between this coming Christ and wisdom? He will have the spirit of wisdom and understanding. He'll know what's what in life. He'll know what proverb to reach for. He'll know how to foolproof your life. So it's no surprise that when Jesus Christ steps onto centre stage in history, it's no surprise that wisdom simply oozes out of him. That's partly why so many people flock to see him. Yet, sure, there were miracles, but here also was a guy who people could sense could help them. Here was someone who they could just tell knew what life was about. And so men and women and boys and girls of all ages just kept seeking Jesus out all the time, asking for help, asking for advice, asking for direction. Jesus himself said about himself in Matthew, "The Queen of the South came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now one greater than Solomon is here." It's just an extraordinary thing for Jesus to say about himself. Oh, you know that Solomon guy and all his wisdom? I'm better. And I think it's taking us to a very special place in thinking about how to foolproof our life. We've seen that the purpose of the book of Proverbs is to help us live well. We've seen that the way it's going to do that is by parading past us lots and lots of observations about life and then overlaying on top of those observations some guidelines about how to best apply them. And in the very first verse is the very first lesson. It's the lesson that foolproofing your life is linked with God's King. For wisdom and prudence and discipline all flow from God's King. Or to put it more simply, Jesus Christ knows best. Jesus actually knows best all the time. Which at one level is very simple, but at another level is very profound. A few years ago, a mate of mine became a Christian. I call him John just in case there's an off chance that some of you might know him, or at least someone listening to this on a website might know him. But before becoming a Christian, John lived a pretty wild life. Plenty of parties, plenty of sex, plenty of substance abuse. But after becoming a Christian, John was reading his Bible and he discovered that Jesus didn't actually want him sleeping around anymore. He actually wanted him to enjoy sex within marriage. And so John said, "Oh, okay." So he stopped having casual sex. And then John kept reading his Bible and he discovered that Jesus actually didn't want him to get drunk all the time. That Jesus wants us to be more disciplined and in control of that. And John thought, "Oh." So he stopped. And he kept reading his Bible and he discovered that Jesus wants us to be honourable and upright in the way that we speak to other people. And John thought to himself, "Oh, okay." So he started working really hard to not gossip at work anymore or tell crude jokes when he was with the guys. And then John kept reading his Bible and he discovered that Jesus wants us to seek first his kingdom. So John turned down a promotion to work overseas and literally earn millions of dollars because he just wanted to stay at his church and work away at following Jesus and helping others do the same. Now, at one level, what John did wasn't rocket science. But I reckon Proverbs would describe him as wise, disciplined, and prudent. And all it was simply doing what God's King says to do. You want to foolproof your life? Just start doing what Jesus says. Why on earth wouldn't we? For even though Solomon's wisdom and understanding was as measureless as the sand on the seashore, in Jesus we have one who is even greater. And so to not do what Jesus says, it's about as clever as sitting in a bath fixing a radio. I'll pray. Father, thank you for this part of your word. Thank you for reminding us of this connection between true wisdom and your King. And so, Father, we pray that by your word and your Spirit, we'd live that out, that we would be spurred on, that we'd be good at spurring each other on to simply doing what Jesus says. Amen.